Huh? Good. Well, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming as we give our initial fiscal report for the fiscal year that just ended in 2011. I'm glad to have the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia here, Bill Bolling, and my Secretary of Finance, Rick Brown, our Chief of Staff, Martin Kent, and other members of our Cabinet who will help to participate in the briefing. As you know, since the meltdown on Wall Street in 2008, there's been significant fiscal stress for virtually every state in the United States. In fact, many states and regions of some states, like Virginia, South Side and Southwest, have had a much more prolonged economic downturn going back several years before that. It's been over a decade in some areas in South Side and Southwest Virginia. So over this last 18 months that I've been privileged to be governor, we've made our top priority focusing on economic development and job creation, and closely related to that, to bring solid, reasonable, fiscal conservative principles to Virginia government. Working together with the Democratic Senate and the Republican House, I think we've fashioned a couple of budgets that reflect Virginia's long-term, responsible, conservative traditions in budgeting. In fact, to the amazement of most, the budget amendments last year passed unanimously in both houses, the first time that I can recall in my 20 years in office that has happened. And I would say that what led us here today is the fact that Virginians understand a couple important things, namely that government must live within its means. Every family understands that, every business understands that, and government at every level must understand that. Obviously we do in Virginia, and obviously they don't in Washington. And so I am delighted to report today that the initial numbers for the close of the 2011 fiscal year indicate that we have experienced a $311 million revenue surplus. This is the second consecutive year that we have had a surplus, which is pretty good news after a couple of years of running short on the revenue projections. The first year since 2008 that we've actually had an increase of revenues. Now you recall last year we had a revenue surplus of $228 million, a spending or savings surplus of $175 million, and that's how we got to that total of $403 million. Now at this point all we know from our current year surplus is the revenue side. Over the next couple of weeks, Secretary Brown and his staff will be closing the books on the spending for fiscal year 11, and then we'll be determining how much we've saved on the spending side. And so I expect that number of 311 to go up, hopefully to meet or exceed the total revenue surplus number that we had for fiscal year 2010. I would say this is also the first time in several years that we've actually had an increase in state revenues over the prior year. So while we had that surplus last year in 2010, that was still a reduction in revenues from the prior year. By that I mean the target number last year for revenue growth in 2010 was minus 2.3. We had actually budgeted a loss in revenues of 2.3%. But because the actual revenues were only down 0.7%, we experienced that $228 million revenue surplus, which was 1.6% above the plan. The good news this year is we were feeling more bullish about the economy, and the budget estimate was 3.5% revenue growth. For the first time in 3 years, we actually budgeted revenue growth. The good news about this revenue figure is that we actually experienced 5.8% revenue growth in 2011, which is 2.3% above the revenue projection. So it's a very positive number, a very good trend that we finished over 2% above our budgeted amount. The other thing I would say to you is, if you remember, I ratcheted up the budget estimates in December based on my Council of Economic Advisors. I ratcheted them up again during the session, during the Budget Conference Committee, because we were feeling good about revenues that we saw in November, December, and January. And even with 2 escalations in the planned budget up to 3.5%, we still finish now at 5.8%. So this is a good trend, a positive trend for Virginia. Secretary Brown's going to give you a little more detailed analysis of how we got there, but suffice it to say that the majority of that growth came from income tax growth, withholding and non-withholding, and refunds netted out at almost $200 million of growth of that 311, and then about $44 million in sales tax growth. And the good thing about that is those 2 tax revenue items are true leading economic indicators. If people are buying more and consuming more, that means they're feeling better about the economy. If people are paying more income taxes, it means that they're earning more, which means they're back to work or they're higher salaries, or again, more people are earning a living. So these 2 drivers of this revenue surplus are indicative of the fact that we've got a recovering economy in our state. As we mentioned, though, we are still back to 2007 levels of both spending and revenues. These revenue numbers, while good for this year, are still slightly lower than the amount of revenues we had coming into the Commonwealth 4 years ago in 2007. A key to what we've done in Virginia is the fact that we decided to budget conservatively, to cut spending dramatically, and to not raise taxes. I think that, to me, is the formula for why Virginia and states like Virginia that have made similar moves have experienced this kind of growth. We've helped to focus Virginia on its core functions. We've funded them well. Even when we were cutting budgets and cutting spending, we still invested in transportation, in higher education, and in economic growth. But we cut in other areas that we thought were of lower priorities. And I think that's the key. When you're governor of Virginia or governor of any other state, you can't do what they do in Washington. In other words, you've got to balance a budget. You can't engage in deficit spending. You can't print money. You can't kick the can down the road and make excuses. You can't get things done later. You have to get them done on time. And that is, I think, why we are able to make this good report today. The other thing that I think has been critically important that we've done, and the Lieutenant Governor will talk about that, is we have tried to focus like a laser on job creation and economic development. There's 2 great ways to raise revenue. One is to raise taxes. That's not our choice in Virginia. The other is to engage in policies which sustain economic growth and job creation and private sector expansion and grow the free enterprise system. That's the Virginia way. That's our Virginia choice. And again, I think that these numbers reflect that those policies are working. We're delighted that we've got this right-to-work law now for many, many decades. We've got great universities, which we're making stronger. But over the last couple of years, we've invested $80 to $100 million in new job-creating tools. Lieutenant Governor has been our leader in that as a Chief Jobs Creation Officer, to find new ways to equip us with tools for economic development, and then, frankly, to take our message on the road around the country and around the world, telling the Virginia story about why businesses are better suited in the most business-friendly state in America, according to CNBC, and that's the Commonwealth of Virginia. And we continue to see the unemployment rate fall from 7.4 to now 6%, third lowest rate east of the Mississippi, 7th lowest in the country. We're expecting those rates to continue to fall. We still have 200,000 plus Virginians, though, that still can't find work. It's an unacceptable level. It's a level that still causes us a lot of heartache and consternation as we govern about how can we make that better and provide more dreams and opportunities so that those numbers can go even higher. But we are where we are through a lot of hard work, and what we've tried to do at the state level is just frankly set the table right. Allow people to compete, to grow, and have government be an ally and not an impediment or an obstacle to free enterprise development. And as a result of that, we've got these surplus revenues that we'll be able to allocate. We've got some preliminary information about how those revenues will be allocated. Again, I want to stress that number is going to grow. We know that we've got somewhere between $35, $40 million or so that agencies we think have already indicated to us that they have saved. But it's going to be another 3 weeks or so, I think, before we have final revenue numbers, and we're certainly hoping that the total surplus will go up. But as we know that we have this surplus, as to today, just on the revenue side, here's where some of that money is going to go, and you've got it in your press packets. $147 million will go to the rainy day fund. That's required by law, depending on the amount of revenues that come in. Unfortunately, we've reduced the rainy day fund up until last year when we made a deposit, and now this will be the largest deposit we've made in quite some time. $32 million will go to water quality improvement, $9 million to the unemployment compensation fund, and because I have some discretion with some of these funds, we're going to direct $4 million to assist families that are still trying to recover from those tornadoes that devastated our state back in April. I requested some contingency appropriations in the budget to include monies for sheriff's offices of about $8 million that will be funded, money for BRAC, the Base Realignment Closure Commission recommendations for Oceana. We also are going to direct a number of some of the surplus funds to go to transportation. As you remember, the current law requires that 2/3 of all unappropriated balances in the surplus go to transportation. Now, there are a lot of other claims on the surplus before we get to an unappropriated balance, but once we have the final numbers, we'll be able to report to you how much of that money will actually go to transportation. Now, let me give you a word of significant caution. We consider this good news solely because it's a trend now, 2 years in a row. But we are far, far away from having certainty and predictability in our state finances. And the reason I say that is that we have significant unfunded liabilities that we're dealing with in Virginia. The Virginia retirement system is $18 billion underfunded. I tried to do some things about that this past session, some success. We're going to do more of that to take on that unacceptable metric this next session. We have significant unemployment compensation deficits as well, like virtually every state does because of the unemployment rate where we have loans from the federal government. So we have those liabilities to deal with. We also have an unprecedented level of unfunded mandates from the federal government, of which you're well aware, some of which we're working through, some of which we have fought against. The unfunded liability through the federal health care bill is some $2.2 billion by the year 2022. This most recent mandate from the Environmental Protection Agency for bay cleanup that we're trying to be good partners in is some $7 to $8 billion levied on the public and private sector in Virginia. Recent discussions with the Department of Justice over some mandates that are being imposed on our state mental health system could rise to the level of $1 billion to $2 billion. So those three alone, we're looking at potentially $10 billion or more in unfunded mandates from the federal government on the Commonwealth of Virginia. And then, of course, we've got other needs that we still need to engage in economic development and transportation, higher education, and others. So it's good news, but we still have a long way to go before I can tell you that we are out of the woods when it comes to meeting our short and long-term obligations. With that, I want to introduce to you the Lieutenant Governor. I'll have more to say about the federal situation here during your questions. But for now, I want to turn it over to Lieutenant Governor for his comments on how we got to this surplus. Lieutenant Governor.
Thank you, Governor, very much. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I will keep my remarks short because I know you all can't wait to see Rick Brown's slides, and he's going to have those up there for you shortly. Let me just reemphasize a couple of the things that the Governor said. First of all, budget surpluses, revenue surpluses or budget surpluses such as those that we experienced last year and announced again today don't just happen. You know, these surpluses come about because a lot of people have worked hard to help create the type of a fiscal environment and an economic environment in our state that produces budget surpluses and not budget shortfalls. If you all remember in 2010, when this administration started, we inherited a budget shortfall that was about $6 billion at the time. And we went to work with our partners in the General Assembly to eliminate that budget shortfall by reducing spending, making a number of other tough management and structural decisions with the way our budget was administered. And then last year, we were able to produce a budget surplus of a little over $400 million. We're heading in that same direction this year. Today, obviously, with the revenue surplus of $311 million, and then more that will likely be added to that on the savings side when the final spending calculations are made for the year. So we've taken steps to restore the financial foundation of the Commonwealth. We're trying to base our budgets on realistic revenue projections. And we've been able to achieve those projections. One of the other pieces of good news in the revenue numbers that we announced today really has to do with going forward. Because if you remember last year, the second year of the budget that started on July 1 is based on a revenue assumption of 6%. But because we've exceeded revenue projections in the prior fiscal year, we now only have to grow about 3.6%. In the current fiscal year in order to be in good position again. So making those sound decisions, you know, basing the budget on realistic revenue projections, reducing spending, it's those types of sound financial decisions that enable us to enjoy these types of surpluses. We've also focused, as the governor said, very heavily on economic growth because we believe that the way to get more money for government to do the things the government needs to do is to grow the economy, not just to raise taxes on the backs of hardworking families and businesses. And we've worked on that very hard over the course of the past 18 months. We have some solid results to show for that. In the last 18 months, we've closed over 500 economic development deals across our state. We've created 67,400 net new jobs in Virginia. That's the 8th highest number of net new jobs created in the nation. And as the governor said, we brought our unemployment rate down from 7.2% to 6%, and it continues to decline. Probably the most encouraging piece of information in these numbers today to me, as someone who's focused on job creation for the last 18 months, is that almost all of this revenue surplus is because withholding is significantly above projection. When people have jobs and when they're working, they're paying payroll taxes. And it's those added payroll taxes in large part that account for this revenue surplus today. So it is good news. Now, secondly, let me reemphasize the thing the governor said at the end of his remarks. This does not by any stretch of the imagination mean that we are out of the financial woods yet. We're not. You know, going forward, we're going to have to continue to focus here in Virginia on budgetary restraint and on economic growth. And I'm confident that we'll do that. But you all know as well as we know that we are living in the midst of some very uncertain economic times. And most of that economic uncertainty isn't taking place in Richmond. Most of that economic uncertainty is taking place in Washington, D.C. And without a doubt, the decision that our federal leaders make or fail to make over the course of the coming weeks could have a dramatic impact on our ability to continue the progress that we've made here in Virginia over the course of the next 18 months. So we need to keep making wise decisions and smart choices in Virginia. I'm confident we'll do that. But we also need to see our colleagues at the federal level get their act together and make the decisions at the federal level that enables Virginia to continue its economic growth as opposed to making decisions or failing to make decisions that could jeopardize our ability to continue to grow our economy. So we are pleased with these numbers. We're going to continue to work hard to do everything we can do to keep them moving in the right direction. And hopefully the last 2 years, last year and this year, will just be the beginning of good news that we'll be able to see here in Virginia for many years to come.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. Now the Secretary of Finance, Rick Brown.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You should have, for the press, you should have a copy of these slides. Lieutenant Governor mentioned the color slides, and let me walk you through some of the numbers and just how we got to the $311 million surplus. Let's go to the bottom line first in total revenues. You can see the chart on page 2 of your handout on total revenues. If you look at total revenues, we had projected 3.5% revenue growth for this year. Coming out of the budgetary session, we actually experienced 5.8% growth, $322 million additional dollars over and above the estimate on the revenue side. When you add transfers, that is the ABC profits, part of the sales tax that goes over to a special fund and a lot of other cost recovery items from non-general funds, the estimate was 2.4% for the year. We came in at 4.5 or $311 million, and that is the bottom line surplus from revenues and transfers. And part of the reason we got there was alluded to that during the fall discussions on revenue, on the economic forecast, the advisory boards wanted to go a little bit more conservative given the uncertainty of the situation. They peeled back a little bit of the employment growth in Virginia from the standard forecast, and that has helped in these uncertain economic times. Over on page 2, you see the withholding. Withholding is about 65% of total revenues. It contributed about $60 million to the surplus. We grew withholding 5% versus an estimate of 4.3%, and 5% is due to job growth. The only wage you get withholding is either wages and salary increases or jobs, and so that is very good news for Virginia. On page 3, you can see the non-withholding side of sales tax basically contributed about a third of the surplus, $110 million. This is tied mainly to non-wage kinds of income, interest, dividends, rents, capital gains, reflects movement in the financial markets. You saw an upward turn in the financial markets last calendar year. It begins to reflect in these figures. But even though the final estimated payments were up 34%, the estimated payments for this year are showing some strength. We had June estimated payments, which is the second quarter for the calendar year, up 15%, so that contribute to this thing. So some of that, even though it's tailed off a little bit, is continuing in the future, and that is good news for Virginia as we move forward. On the refund side, we issued about 2.8 million refunds, 6,500 more than we did the last year. The check size, however, was down about 7%, and as a result, we issued less refunds than we had forecast, about 27.7 million. Taken together, the three components of income tax, withholding, non-withholding, refunds, contributed about 2/3 of the surplus, or $198 million. On the sales tax, we had projected a negative 3.7% going into this year. We ended up at minus 2.3%. It added about $43 million. One of the things you'll see as we go through this litany of sources, all the major sources in Virginia showed a positive gain, so it was a pretty broad-based, even though it's centered in income tax, a pretty broad-based performance for the year. Net corporate income, about $55 million in total to the surplus. We had projected a decline in corporate income about 7.3%, had an increase, a decline of 4.9%, and about a 7.3% variance on that source. In recordation, primarily the housing market, we grew 0.6% barely. We had forecast a 5.6% decline. It was about $18 million contribution to the bottom line. On insurance premiums, again, we had estimated about 6% growth, came in 7.5, about $4 million to the bottom line. Over on page 8, you can get a sort of a synopsis, and this is probably one of the slides that it was suggested you use for your stories, because I tried to capture pretty much everything that's happening on this one page. You see the official estimate for 11, that was the budgetary estimate in the first column, and the percent change that was in the budget, that's what we assumed or what we forecasted. You see the actual collections for 11 in the third column. The fourth column shows the actual percent change over actual 10 to 11, and then the amount of variance in millions of dollars. You can see 322 on the revenue line down at the bottom, second from the bottom, and then at the very bottom, 311 million. One of the things that you'll note going out into 12, going forward, 12 over actual 11, is what the Lieutenant Governor alluded to. If you look at revenues projections that are embedded in the budget bill for 12, it would take a 6% increase over what was forecast for 11 to meet the 12 estimate. With the growth that we've had in the base for 11, that's been cut back to 3.7%. So about a third of what that growth change would have been from 11 to 12. We've eaten into that quite a bit with this surplus, and that's probably very, very good news given the certain uncertain times that we face right now. Over on page 9, you can see some of the commitments against this $311 million. The governor alluded $146 million. We have for the stabilization fund, basically around $300 million in the stabilization fund. So yeah, so grow it almost by half. This number, once finally audited, could come down slightly. It deals with the acceleration payback to transportation, whether those funds are in the general fund or whether they're actually in the transportation trust. If we certify that we can pay them back, which it appears that we will, based on this, then that will affect the calculation somewhat of stabilization fund, and that 146 may come down slightly. The unemployment compensation payroll, this is the interest that we owe the federal government. Item 115 in the Appropriation Act required that we reserve out of the surplus 8.9 to pay the feds. April tornadoes, the disasters and personal assistance. We've got paperwork going through. The governor probably hasn't seen this yet. He suspects that about 4.3 million that will eventually come off of the bottom line. And then we have BRAC and a supplemental appropriation for the local sheriff's offices. You might recall this was an issue in the reconvened session, both of which were a draw on the surplus. If we realized it at this stage of the game, it appears that we'll be able to pay both of those. On the bottom line, once we get the actual reversions from agencies from the operating accounts and get those all reconciled, then we'll be able to figure out the 2/3, 1/3 split, what goes to transportation, and then sort of what's left over that at this stage of the game we plan to use for contribution to the unfunded liabilities in the retirement system. At the end of the day, on August 18th, you'll see the whole list. I suspect that the whole 311 will be dedicated at that time. And that will do me.
All right, thank you, Mr. Secretary. With that, we'll be glad to take any questions. Mike. You want to comment on that? I think we've got limitations. It's not individual. It's got to be for basically state relief, state overtime, or local government overtime. You want to expand on that, Rick?
It's a little bit of both. On the personal assistance that we reimburse localities, they've already, in some instances, already paid, and in some instances overtime for the emergency state agencies, Department of State Police, Transportation. You had conservation involved in this with the damage to one of the parks on the south side. So it's a whole array of bills. These things take a long time to sort of clear out, but that is the estimate that we have at this stage of the game. That paperwork, it's making its way up to the governor now. I do know the figure because I've been reviewing the paperwork, but he hasn't signed off on that yet, but it will be a commitment that's right around the corner.
You know, Mike, on that, we're obviously very disappointed with our multiple rebuffs from FEMA on federal disaster relief. I saw some of them at the National Governors Association meeting this week and expressed that personally to them. But at the same time, we're going to do everything we can here. We already had allocated about $700,000 from the state. We had reimbursed Pulaski County directly about $650,000 a while back. In your backyard, of course, between Glade Spring and Washington County and Pulaski, we had 3 tornadoes with significant damage. We have done a lot of things through our combined Virginia campaign to solicit private contributions. We've got a couple of very generous donors who are stepping forward, and we'll have some announcements on that soon. In the meantime, we started the encouragement for people at ABC stores to donate. I think on the first day we raised $20,000, something like that. So people are still giving, still concerned, especially in light of the lack of help from the federal government. We're going to do everything we can through this appropriation from the state and some rather significant things that are going to happen in the private sector, too. Yes, sir. Hank. Yes. Specifically in the budget. When I sent down budget amendments in April at the reconvened session, there were several appropriations I asked the General Assembly to approve that was conditioned upon us having a surplus this year. One was the $7 million for the sheriffs, and the other was $7.5 million for Oceana. We had specifically contributed that in the first year of the biennium, but not in the second year of the biennium, and so it was a contingent appropriation. But it's solely for that multi-year obligation that we are making. Even though the BRAC order wasn't really put in place, we're trying to comply with the spirit of that BRAC order, which basically requires an ongoing commitment to reduce encroachment around Naval Oceana Air Station, and this helps Virginia Beach. They match it, by the way. They do 7.5 as well. So you got $15 million going to basically buying real estate to reduce private dwellings around Oceana, because obviously that is a great source of pride, having Oceana master jet base in Virginia, and secondly, it's a great source of economic development. So this year, and we'll have to discuss what we're going to do in the future, but we want to continue that to show the Navy that we're serious about keeping that base here. Yep. Yep. I can't say whether anything out of that surplus, it's not likely to be great. Last year, under this formula, with a $403 million surplus, it was $36 million or $32 million? 32 million. So it's not a big number. We're trying to change the formula because even though it's 2/3 of all the surplus, it's after, about 10 other things. So by the time you get to what's left over, it's 2/3 of a lot smaller amount. It's not 2/3 of 400 million. So very little probably will go to that. But I will say we're working on some other things on an ongoing basis with Secretary LaHood and our local government funding partners and the MWA board and others to try to make sure that we keep that project on track, but keep it on budget and not jack it up another $1 billion for local governments and local taxpayers up there. So we're working on that, making some progress, and hopefully 20th tomorrow, there might be some action taken by the Dulles folks. Anita? Yeah. Yeah, I'm very unhappy. In fact, we're furious. It's a national embarrassment for the United States of America to be getting 2 weeks from being defaulting on its obligations. And, we've got a Republican House and a Democratic Senate here in Virginia. And we've laid out some very clear goals about how we're going to work together, and we get things done. Unanimous budget passes one day late. In fact, you all wrote that the world was falling because we were one day late. Now they're a year and a half late in Washington. So through no fault of our own, we have a AAA bond rating that's been in place since 1938 that we've been informed just hours ago may be in jeopardy, and we're put on the watch list because of the inability and ineptitude of the President and the Congress to reach a deal on how to fund the obligations of the United States of America. We'll be corresponding with them in detail, probably tomorrow, on this issue. There are 4 other states that were put on this list. We understand that we get a significant amount of money from the federal government because of the Defense Department and other obligations that we receive. And it's solely because of that amount of federal funding that comes to us, and it being in jeopardy if there's not an agreement, that they placed us on the watch list. I personally visited Moody's and the other 2 rating agencies in New York last year. I brought the Republican and Democrat leaders from both houses up there. And Moody's couldn't have been any more complimentary of, Secretary Brown was there as well. Couldn't have been any more complimentary about the way we're doing things in Virginia. They said they'd like to see us make progress on infrastructure. We did that. So apart from this federal inaction, I would say their reports would even be better. So it's not the first time. I think it's the 3rd time in the last, 20 years or so, Rick, we've been on a watch list. And but it is a source of great alarm and consternation for us in Virginia, as I imagine it is for the other 4 governors, including my neighbor to the north in Maryland, my neighbor to the south in South Carolina and Tennessee. And I think it's going to take strong leadership. The President and his party failed to produce a budget. They had both houses of Congress. They had the presidency long before the Republicans took over last November. And on October 1, when the budget was supposed to be in place, there was no budget. The budget that the President put forth was laughed out of Congress by both parties. And this President's contributed $4.5 trillion to the national debt in 2.5 years. It's an unprecedented and unsustainable and immoral level of spending. Now, every family in America, every business in America knows you can't spend more than you take in for any sustainable period of time. You go broke. Now, apparently they don't understand that in Washington. But for the last 30 years, that's what they've done. Frankly, it's been Republican and Democrat presidents and Congresses that have contributed to this mess. In fact, every president since 1980 has contributed to an increase in the national debt except for Bill Clinton. Now, the bills are due. And if I was in charge, I'd cut spending dramatically in every area of the federal budget. But I do it the way we did it in Virginia last year with the help of everybody from Tommy Norman to Dick Saslaw to Ward Armstrong to Bill Howell. And that is, we set priorities, we cut spending in low priority areas, and we made investments in the things that were going to be important for the future: transportation, education, job creation. Why they can't do that on a responsible basis in Washington is just beyond me. It is a toxic environment. There's plenty of blame to go around. At this point, it is a pox on both parties and both houses and the President that they can't lead and get this deal done. It's imperative that they get this done because if they don't, not only will it be embarrassing, but it will create an international financial crisis, and Virginia and our 4 other sister states are going to be the first ones to be victim to that. Bob. Well, one thing I've learned over the last 20 years, I've served in majorities and I've served in minorities. During the couple of years I've been governor, we've had split government for only one of the few times in Virginia history. We just presided over a redistricting session. First time in Virginia history that we've had a divided legislature, and yet we got that done. So I would say look at the Virginia way. When you can get Kurt Cox and Ed Howe working together to get a budget done, you can get Dick Saslaw and Bill Howell working together to get things done with some help from the administration. You know, we find ways to get things done in Virginia. We tone down the rhetoric, we focus on results, we focus on solving problems, and things happen. Now, that's the atmosphere that I would try to create if I was calling the shots. If it was solely up to me, I'd cut spending. No one can argue that $14.2 trillion is a good number for the United States of America, which will clearly go to over 20 trillion, no matter whose plan passes, which is the highest level of debt as a percentage of GDP since the end of the Second World War, 70 years. It's ridiculous. No business or no family could run their operations the way Washington is running itself. So, having said all that, my preference would be to cut spending. And whether it's the Ryan plan of $4 trillion or the other plan from Senator Tom Coburn of $9 trillion. I mean, there are plans that are out there. But I realize when you have a divided government with a Democratic Senate and a Republican House, same thing I've got in Virginia, neither side is going to be able to get everything they want. So you've got to be able to find some compromise for the good of the citizens. I think you've got to look at whether all the tax preferences that litter the code of the United States are still working. So, yes, evaluating exemptions and tax preferences and credits to see, do they still make economic sense? Are they getting the value that they were expected? Does the policies embedded in those credits still make economic sense? Yeah, you ought to ask those questions. And I think that may be some area for middle ground. My preference would be spending cuts for obvious reasons. When you're $14 trillion overspent, everybody understands you need to cut spending. And that's what you ought to do first and foremost. Everybody understands that we have an unsustainable entitlement system. Can't keep up this level of spending with Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Medicaid's busting the budget in Virginia, 1,600% increase in 27 years. So absolutely, that's got to be the first place that you have it done. And I wish the Democrats in Washington would understand that. But since they don't, there's got to be some compromise, or we default and the greatest country on earth is the laughingstock of the world. That's not acceptable. Well, I'm not going to tell them how to do it. We figured out how to do it in Virginia. I mean, I just gave you the answer. No side's going to get everything that they want. That's the nature of compromise. We've had several compromises on budgets over the last 2 years. You know, I didn't get everything I want out of either house with Republicans and Democrats in the proposals that I made. But we found a middle ground in a way that we got a unanimous budget for the first time in 20 years. And it's just the political realities. If you don't control all three offices, Senate, House, and presidency or governor, you've got to find some middle ground. And that's what we were able to do in Virginia. Olympia. Yeah. Yeah, all the factors, and I'll let Rick comment on this. We just looked at or the Lieutenant Governor, because they've studied a little more carefully. Every factor that they outlined in there were 2 or 3, has to do with what's happening in Washington. It's not anything that we're doing here in Virginia. So, as I mentioned, I was, when we visited them in January, they were very complimentary of the way our resources have been managed here, but it's related to federal budget and the number of federal employees and the impending meltdown in Washington if they don't get an agreement. On VRS, I can't tell you, you know, I pushed last year for a down payment. We withheld a total of $675 million from the retirement system last year. We pledged to pay that back with interest over 10 years so that we would not reduce by a dime the corpus in the retirement system, about $75 million a year for 10 years. We accelerated those payments last year with a $35 million payment, I think. Is that right, Rick? In the $20-some million that we paid back already in advance. Until we get the final spending numbers, Olympia, and until I get the advice of the Council of Economic Advisors, in October, and honestly, until I get the final revenue estimates in November from the Council of Economic Advisors, I can't tell you what the revenue estimates are going to look like. I mean, we feel pretty good with the existing growth estimate of 6% in 2012, based on the fact that we grew 2.5% over our estimate this year. We feel that that's pretty attainable. But between now and November, and between what happens in Washington and other things in the world, we're going to have to take a look at the actual revenue estimates. But I can tell you that solvency of the retirement system is an absolute top priority for me. I said last year, I don't want to kick the can down the road. I don't want to pass this mess on to another governor. It's clearly a problem. We're $18 billion underfunded. We're going to be only 61% funded by 2014, according to JLARC, and that's not acceptable. I made some tough proposals to the General Assembly last year. They accepted some, they rejected others. I am going to go back with some proposals next year to try to not just plug the gap, but to create the long-term fixes that are necessary so I can look state employees in the eye and promise them that that money will be there when they retire. Right now, we can't do that. Yes, sir. Yes. It was. Well, it was considered and rejected. I proposed 2% this year as an incentive for state agencies to save money. Save money, you get a bonus. But the proposal was they would have had to save twice as much as the cost of the bonus, and you would have had to have at least a satisfactory performance review. The General Assembly approved it last year. They rejected it this year, unfortunately. And so we created some other incentives, frankly, for our state agencies with this suggestion campaign and some other things to encourage them to find ways to save money. One of the horrible things in government at every level, it's worse at the federal level. I've been there for 21 years in the military. But there is an incentive to say you spend every dime you have at the end of the fiscal year, because if you don't, you're not going to get the money the next year. That's no way to govern. So we try to create incentives to save, and if you know you're going to get part of the savings in a bonus, makes perfect sense. It worked last year. We saved $175 million, and we dished out $80 million in bonuses. Great deal for the taxpayers. Unfortunately, they rejected it in the General Assembly this year, so I'm not able to do it. But Secretary Brown might comment. We have a active and a retooled gain sharing program and some other things that we're looking at. And we'll likely make some additional proposals to the General Assembly this year to engage our employees and managers. It's pretty simple. If you're feeling ownership in government, if you know you might get rewarded based on the performance of your government, you're going to care a lot more. And those are the type of things that I'm trying to embed in our culture in the state. Rick, you want to talk any more about those couple of things?
Just on the bonus, again, we did propose that it wasn't there. In June, Chief of Staff went out a letter to state agencies saying if you will designate balances at year end, we will guarantee you to carry forward 25% of those balances and make sure that you get the money as soon as we close the books, which will be the 18th of August. We will have that payment within 1 month by September 15th back to the agencies. And we did. That's where the governor alluded to, about $35 million designated from state agencies came in. Now, some of that is local pass-through and probably won't be eligible for the program, but there's a lot there that is. So we'll have some money once we get to the actual agency savings on August 18th that will be recommended for reappropriation back to the state agencies in this mark-off as an incentive and a reward. We're also looking at other ways of gain sharing for efficiency kinds of arrangements where, all too often that's a one-way street on agencies where if they effectuate efficiencies of any kind, they just lose the money. What about a revenue sharing kind of arrangement for those situations? So we've got some things in discussions on the table with Secretary Hicks Thomas and myself about how we might go forward on that front and share. And essentially what are good actions for taxpayers.
We got time for one last question. Is that consternation? I thought it was condemnation, but
Well, see that as a may, localities, sort of,
yeah, I think there's some of those actions, and we're going to look at those. One of the things, I signed a bill this year to create a more formal approach to local government mandates, to be able to look for those things that we can eliminate. We did ask for input last year, and we're very disappointed with the response that we got from local government, so we're going to solicit them again. I'd like nothing better than to eliminate mandates on local governments from the state. The Secretary is having a little group to take a look at those. Right now, about 53% of the budget goes forward to local governments. A little about 50% passes through to local governments. Clearly, if we're back to 2007 spending levels, we've made some reductions in spending, and consequently, some of that has affected localities. But I certainly believe that they would have done the same thing that we did, and that is set priorities and to make the best decisions for their own constituents. But I'm very open and very eager to find ways to reduce the burdens on local government, and you know, to the degree they've got good ideas, we'll look at implementing them. Hey, thanks everybody for coming. I appreciate it.